Pack your bags right now because your sister requires the master suite for her new wardrobe, and you are no longer welcome in this house. My mother, Estelle, spat those words at me with absolute venom on a quiet Sunday morning. The moment my own mother looked me in the eyes and ordered me to pack my bags was the exact second I realized family meant absolutely nothing. She coldly demanded I leave our ancestral home immediately so my utterly spoiled older sister, Roxanne, could steal the life I built. They had completely forgotten who spent the last 20 years paying off every single family debt. Thank you for watching this video. Before I take you back there, do me one small favor. Take a second to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. It helps more than you know. My name is Loretta, and I am 50 years old. For my entire adult life, I served as the ultimate shock absorber for a family that viewed me strictly as an appliance. My mother, Estelle, was a woman entirely obsessed with the illusion of high society. She spent her days attending endless charity luncheons, sipping expensive champagne, and acting like the undisputed queen of our affluent suburban county. She was completely addicted to the prestige of the Blackwood name, while our family finances secretly rotted away beneath her feet. My older sister, Roxanne, was the golden child. She was 55 years old, yet she navigated life with the absolute entitlement of a spoiled toddler. She was loud, wasteful, and deeply convinced that the universe owed her a life of extreme luxury simply because she possessed a pretty face and our father's last name. To understand the sheer audacity of their betrayal, we must look back exactly 20 years. Our father passed away suddenly from a massive heart attack, leaving behind a staggering mountain of hidden gambling debts. The majestic Blackwood Estate, our historic family home in upstate New York featuring 20 acres of pristine woodland and a sprawling Victorian mansion, was completely drowning in notices of foreclosure. Federal tax liens were piled high on the mahogany dining table. Estelle was utterly paralyzed by the prospect of losing her social status. She locked herself in her master bedroom, pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, and completely refused to face reality. She genuinely believed that if she ignored the federal notices long enough, the problems would simply evaporate. Roxanne, perfectly true to her parasitic nature, packed her massive collection of designer bags and fled to Europe on a wealthy older man's dime. She abandoned us the very minute the money dried up. I remember standing in the grand foyer, watching her load her expensive luggage into a black town car. She looked at me with an expression of sheer pity and told me she could not bear the horrific stress of poverty. She claimed her delicate nerves were simply not built for financial hardship, leaving me alone in a crumbling mansion with a mother who refused to speak to anyone except her phantom society friends. I was the one who stayed behind. I was the one who worked 16 hours every single day to keep the federal agents from seizing our front doors. I took a grueling job managing a massive logistics company by day, dealing with relentless shipping schedules and screaming truck drivers. By night, I did complex freelance bookkeeping for local businesses, staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred. I poured every single dollar I earned into saving the estate. I negotiated with ruthless bankers who initially looked at me like a foolish little girl trying to bail out a sinking ocean liner with a plastic bucket. I skipped meals. I wore the same 3 plain dresses for 5 entire years. I sacrificed my youth, my peace, and any chance of a personal life to keep a roof over my delusional mother's head. What they did not know, and what I guarded with profound silence, was the true nature of my financial rescue. I did not just blindly pay off the endless loans. I systematically purchased the debt. Through a series of quiet, fiercely negotiated agreements with the lending institutions, I converted those massive liabilities into direct equity. Every time I handed over a brutal payment that drained my personal bank accounts, my legal ownership of the Blackwood Estate increased. Slowly, methodically, over 2 brutal decades, I became the absolute owner of the property. I transformed myself from the family workhorse into the ultimate predator of our own debt. Blood is often just a biological coincidence, but true ownership is built on staggering sacrifice. Fast forward to that fateful Sunday morning. Roxanne had returned from Europe a week prior, completely broke after her latest wealthy boyfriend discarded her for a younger woman. She arrived in a cheap taxi, carrying the remnants of her luxurious lifestyle, but her sheer arrogance remained entirely intact. Instead of being humbled by her failures, she was more aggressive than ever. Estelle welcomed her back like returning royalty. Suddenly, my quiet, exhausted existence was a massive problem for their glamorous fantasy. They decided that I was too depressing, too plain, and too much of a reminder of their past struggles to remain in the main house. They wanted to pretend the last 20 years of desperate poverty never happened. Roxanne strutted into my home office wearing a silk robe that I had unknowingly paid for through the household account. She looked around my practical workspace with absolute disgust, wrinkling her nose at my heavy filing cabinets and multiple computer monitors. She crossed her arms and stared at me like I was a diseased rat invading her palace. "You need to be out by this evening. I am redecorating, and this dreary little room is going to be my new shoe closet. You dragged down the energy of the entire house, Loretta." I looked at her. I did not yell. I did not cry. My expression remained entirely frozen. The icy calm that settled over my brain was absolute. I had spent 2 decades building an unbreakable fortress, and she was trying to kick down the steel door wearing cheap designer heels. I simply placed my pen down on the mahogany desk. I opened my top drawer and pulled out the heavy silver ring of antique household keys. I handed them to her without a single word. She snatched them eagerly, a triumphant smirk spreading across her heavily powdered face. They had absolutely no idea that my silent surrender was the final bait in a trap they had willingly walked into. Over the next 48 hours, the sheer delusion of my family was on full display. Roxanne immediately hired an absurdly expensive interior decorator who charged $500 an hour just to walk through the front doors. She ordered the household staff, whom I personally paid out of my own pocket, to begin throwing my modest belongings into the trash. Estelle stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, beaming with immense pride as she watched her golden child behave like an unhinged tyrant. They treated me like a dismissed, untrustworthy servant as I quietly packed a single small suitcase and walked out the back door. I sat on a weathered wooden bench at the far edge of the property, watching their circus unfold through the massive glass windows of the conservatory. I was completely calm. The ice in my veins had fully solidified. They thought they had finally eliminated the boring sister, but they were dancing directly on top of a legal landmine. The first catastrophic crack in their fragile facade happened on Tuesday afternoon. Roxanne decided to host a lavish welcome-home party for herself, inviting all the local socialites to celebrate her triumphant return. She marched into the most exclusive jewelry boutique in the city center to purchase a diamond necklace for the occasion. She proudly handed the cashier the Platinum Family Credit Card, a card that drew directly from the estate's central trust. The machine beeped loudly. The transaction was completely declined. Roxanne laughed nervously, demanding the clerk run it again, screaming about the Blackwood family name and her immense personal wealth. She insulted the clerk, calling him incompetent. The machine declined it a second time, flashing a bright red error code. The boutique manager walked over and politely informed her that the account was entirely frozen due to unauthorized access. Roxanne caused a massive scene, screaming at the staff and humiliating herself in front of the very high society women she desperately wanted to impress. She stormed out of the boutique empty-handed, her face burning with sheer rage. She called Estelle in absolute hysterics, demanding to know why the bank was insulting her. Estelle, still wearing her velvet dressing gown, rushed to her massive desktop computer in the estate library to check the family trust portal. She typed in her familiar credentials. The screen immediately flashed a bright red error message. The administrative passwords were changed. Estelle frantically dialed the private banking concierge. The representative on the phone coldly informed her that she possessed absolutely no authorization to access the information. Every single liquid asset, every line of credit, and every operational fund associated with the Blackwood estate was abruptly sealed shut. The financial lifeblood of their imaginary empire was completely drained in a single, devastating instant. Absolute panic set in. Estelle, completely frantic and hyperventilating, picked up the telephone and dialed the number for Vance. Vance was a 60-year-old legal heavyweight, a man who possessed a terrifying reputation for absolute ruthlessness in matters of corporate and estate law. He had been adjacent to our family for years, primarily handling the tedious paperwork I sent him. "Vance, you must get over here immediately. Loretta has stolen our money. That ungrateful little thief has locked us out of our own accounts. I want a federal warrant for her arrest. I want her thrown in the county jail today for estate fraud." Vance was entirely silent on the other end of the line. He did not offer any comfort. He spoke in a tone that was completely devoid of warmth, sounding more like a judge handing down a sentence than a family friend. He simply stated he would arrive at the estate in exactly 1 hour and advised them not to touch another single thing. Roxanne and Estelle sat in the grand parlor, practically vibrating with vicious excitement. They truly believed the legal system was about to violently crush me for daring to touch their presumed inheritance. They poured themselves glasses of expensive scotch, toasting to my impending imprisonment. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy oak doors of the parlor swung open. Vance entered the room carrying a thick, incredibly heavy leather briefcase. He wore a dark gray suit and an expression of profound boredom. I walked into the room directly behind him, having stepped inside from the garden. I did not sit down on the plush furniture. I stood perfectly still near the massive marble fireplace, watching them with eyes that felt like black ice. Estelle aggressively shoved a handwritten document across the antique glass coffee table. It was a crude, pathetic piece of paper where she had desperately signed over the entire estate and all its contents to Roxanne just hours prior, hoping to protect the assets from me. "Here is the deed of transfer. We're having her arrested for federal estate fraud," Estelle demanded, her face completely red with fury and cheap alcohol. "I want her in handcuffs, Vance." Vance looked down at the piece of paper. He slowly reached out, picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated, and let it flutter to the floor like a piece of meaningless trash. The room grew absolutely cold. "Estelle," Vance said, his voice slicing through the room like a federal blade. "You have zero legal authority to sign any deed, transfer any asset, or demand any warrant. You have not owned a single brick of this property for exactly 15 years. The mask completely slipped from Estelle's face. Her skin was utterly drained of color, transforming into a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. Roxanne looked as though she had been physically struck in the stomach by an invisible force. Vance slowly unlatched his heavy briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of certified legal documents, complete with thick federal seals, authorized bank signatures, and municipal stamps. He dropped them heavily onto the glass table, the loud thud echoing through the silent room like a gavel strike. "This is the official registry of the Blackwood estate," Vance continued, pointing a sharp, unforgiving finger at the thick stack of papers. "Loretta bought out the defaulted mortgages 2 decades ago when you completely abandoned your financial responsibilities. She holds the exclusive proprietary deed. She is the sole trustee of the holding corporation. She legally owns exactly 72% of the entire estate, while the remaining 28% belongs to the federal bank. Your name, Estelle, was permanently removed from the Federal Registry during the quiet bankruptcy proceedings you completely chose to ignore." The silence that followed was staggering. The grand parlor, once their undisputed kingdom of arrogance, suddenly felt like a federal prison cell. The air was completely sucked out of the room. Roxanne began to tremble violently, her expensive silk robe suddenly looking absurdly out of place. She leaned forward and looked closely at the documents, seeing my name typed in bold, undeniable ink across every single line of absolute authority. The legal reality completely shattered their entire existence. The illusion was dead. I was not the exhausted maid they could order around. I was the absolute landlord of their entire reality. Estelle fell to her knees, her velvet gown pooling around her on the expensive Persian rug. The arrogant, untouchable queen was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating old woman facing genuine ruin. She began to sob uncontrollably, desperately reaching out toward my shoes. She tried to change her entire tone, suddenly begging me to remember that I was her precious daughter. She pleaded for mercy, crying loudly about family loyalty, blood ties, and forgiveness. Roxanne slumped deeply against the velvet sofa, weeping loudly and immediately turning on our mother, screaming that Estelle had lied to her about the money. I looked down at them, feeling absolutely nothing. The well of empathy I had reserved for my family had dried up 20 years ago, replaced by cold, hard concrete. "Pack your bags right now," I said, my voice completely flat and barely above a whisper, echoing her exact cruel words from Sunday morning. "I require the master suite to be empty, and you are no longer welcome on my property." Estelle wailed, completely refusing to move. Roxanne threatened to call the police, screaming that I could not legally do this to them. I just smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that finally made them realize I was completely serious. I gave them exactly 2 hours to gather whatever cheap personal items they could carry. When they stubbornly refused to move fast enough, Vance pulled out his phone and made a single, brief phone call to the county sheriff's precinct. 10 minutes later, 2 heavily armed, uniformed deputies arrived at the front door with an official eviction warrant to personally oversee their immediate removal. The humiliation was absolute. Estelle and Roxanne were physically forced by the deputies to drag their cheap suitcases down the long, sweeping gravel driveway in the freezing, pouring rain. They begged the officers for access to the luxury vehicles parked in the garage, but Vance calmly provided the registration documents proving every single car belonged strictly to my holding company. I stood on the second-floor balcony, completely shielded from the rain, sipping a hot cup of black tea. I watched without a single blink as a rusted, foul-smelling yellow taxi pulled up to the main gate to carry them away forever. 6 months later, I am sitting in the perfectly quiet, sunlit garden of my beautiful estate. I am completely at peace, watching the brilliant autumn leaves fall gently across the intricate stone pathways I paid for with my own blood and sweat. I finally hired a proper management team for the property, and for the first time in my adult life, I am learning how to actually rest. Estelle and Roxanne are currently living together in a cramped, terribly insulated one-bedroom apartment on the absolute worst side of town. Roxanne was violently forced by reality to take a grueling minimum wage job at a greasy local diner just to pay for their monthly heating bill. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she comes home smelling like fried food and bleach every single night. They try to call me repeatedly from various restricted numbers, leaving desperate voicemails begging for a small allowance, but my legal team intercepts every single attempt and immediately deletes them. I gained an immense, unshakable freedom that none of their fake prestige or cruel arrogance could ever buy. I reclaimed my entire life, and I did it by letting their own profound greed completely destroy them. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this story. What did you think about how Loretta handled her mother and sister? Do you think she should have given them a second chance, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories where justice is served cold, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next one.